Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, a new record has been hit in the supply chain crisis. As of yesterday, 100 cargo ships are currently anchored waiting to get into the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, with 45 more ships expected within the next 3 days. Now, the previous record was 97 ships waiting on September 19th. So what is going on? What is causing the delays? Are we witnessing a complete meltdown of the global supply chain, similar to the collapse of the housing market in 2008? Or is this just an expected side effect from the pandemic? Well, unfortunately, I think we might be witnessing a complete collapse that's going to require an entire overhaul of the system, and we haven't seen the worst of it yet. Now, the Biden administration is painting this as something that's going to hinder our holiday shopping, but the empty shore shelves, limited menus at restaurants, and rising prices are telling us an entirely different story. What's happening is much worse than anything they'll admit, and quite frankly, the problem isn't Biden's fault. It's been building up for decades. Like the 2008 housing collapse, the supply chain crisis has been long in the making, and it just took a few small events and even a large pandemic, I suppose, to strain it. But it boils down to this. The country is heavily reliant on imports. We've allowed the lure of low-cost goods and cheap labor to dismantle home-based production in favor of offshoring many of our essentials. We've deregulated some of our most needed transportation infrastructure, including our ports and the trucking industry, and we've let companies monopolize and put profits over absolutely everything. Our government not only allowed it to happen, they facilitated it, and now we're discovering just how reliant we are on foreign goods and just how bad of an idea it's been to hobble our nation's infrastructure, all in the name of saving a buck and making a few more. Now, let's break this down further and start with our reliance on imports. 44% of U.S. imports come from Asia, 30% from neighbors in Mexico and Canada, and 25% from Europe. People like to pay low prices, and getting things shipped in from developing nations such as China, Vietnam, and Mexico allow us to do this. But when the pandemic first hit, we saw shortages of essential supplies, highlighting just how reliant we are on goods and parts manufactured in foreign countries, and how maybe globalization has its downfalls. Oops. Well, luckily this time it was an unforeseen virus, but in the future, if it's war or other hostilities, it seems pretty clear we need to ensure we can rapidly manufacture certain items of national importance here at home. Now, Trump campaigned on bringing manufacturing and jobs back to America and was heavily scoffed at by people who asserted the U.S. would never revert back into becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. Those days are gone, and we should leave that to poorer countries who can still supply cheap labor. But after the pandemic hit, the Biden administration saw the value in this way of thinking. And in February of this past year, Biden assigned a task force to identify the nation's import vulnerabilities with the possibility of ramping back up domestic production. Probably a good idea. Now, this current supply chain fiasco might speed up his review process and look into the fact that it isn't only that we rely on foreign goods, but our deregulated, privatized transportation infrastructure needs a serious rethink as well. Clearly, in many cases, we are able to get the goods, and clearly countries are trying to deliver what we've ordered. I mean, 100 ships waiting at sea showcases this. But a second issue we're dealing with are greedy companies who've monopolized industries and scaled back on their workforce. After all, fewer employees, lower costs, higher profits. The backlog at the ports has mostly to do right now with the lack of truckers on the roads. Before the pandemic, there already was a record shortage of truckers. The industry has a turnover rate of over 90% year after year. And as former congressional candidate and trucker himself, Joshua Collins, points out, the shortage began when Jimmy Carter deregulated the trucking industry. Quote, Jimmy Carter deregulated the trucking industry in 1980. The Teamsters Union went from 2 million truckers to now only 75,000. Non-union trucking companies pay shitty wages and can't keep drivers. That's why we have a trucker shortage and why your grocery stores have empty shelves. And my grandpa was a Teamster, and he was able to support a family of 9 with his salary. Times sure have changed, and perhaps not for the better. So this brings me back to why I say this issue it isn't just a temporary, fleeting problem that will resolve itself. This instead is similar to the housing crisis of 2008 that required an entire system overhaul. Decades of reliance on foreign-made goods has proven unwise. A country closing its borders for any number of reasons could halt our ability to get what we need. Deregulation and lax antitrust laws have allowed companies to consolidate and monopolize, leaving workers with low wages and poor working conditions that hasn't attracted them to one of the nation's most important industries. On top of this, talk of automating jobs away has made manufacturing and trucking less appealing careers for younger people to go into. Our supply chain has been neglected and taken for granted for decades, and we're now feeling the effects of allowing the thirst for cheap goods to chip away at one of our most important sectors. Come hell or high water, we need certain goods manufactured at home. This is and never to be offshored. We also need the ports, trucking, and our rail industries to be our most well-oiled machines, or should I say well-solared or well-electric, what have you, with workers whose salaries match the level of importance of their jobs. Truly, absolutely essential and a matter of national security. But this sort of overhaul to correct the current catastrophe, which is nothing short of a catastrophe, and it's not just because we won't have a nice Christmas. A lack of goods hitting the shelves or food in the kitchens of restaurants means these businesses are once again hobbled and at risk of going under. And I don't think I need to explain how businesses going under could have a terrible ripple effect in our economy and what it means for American families. Plus, rising food prices means struggling families will have lower quality meals, which means more obesity, which means poor health and worse COVID outcomes. We need this problem solved, and it's likely going to take a complete system overhaul to do it. But will we do it? Will the Biden administration recognize this for the crisis it is, or will they continue to pretend like it's just a matter of some kids not getting their teddy bears this year? And I'm curious if you guys think this is something that people are taking as seriously as it is. But 100 ships out at sea right here. I'm looking out at the ocean, and I can see these ships waiting out there. And that, of course, the ships out there dragging their anchors along caused the oil spill crisis down in Orange County. This is a catastrophe. And I just feel like the administration is kind of saying, well, you know, we may or may not have a good Christmas this year if we can't get those ships into port.
Kim, we've had such a good streak of agreement. I think this is one where I largely disagree with you, although I agree with some of the things you said. I'm not overly eager to have the government kind of decide, well, a certain amount of our manufacturing should take place domestically. Just for an example, right now in D.C., our metro system is completely collapsing for various reasons. One of them, I didn't know this until just today, but because of the Buy American law, they had to actually obtain a lot of the materials for the new train cars in America, and they don't work well, and there's these safety concerns, and the whole system is down right now and completely falling apart. So the idea that domestic manufacturing can be just as shoddy as manufacturing elsewhere. So that's my counter.
Right. So
thought for you.
But to me, the solution is improve domestic manufacturing.
Right. Exactly.
Rather than just shut it. You know, because let's say that we're 10, 20 years down the road, and other countries have continued along this path of kind of nationalism, and decide that they don't want to ship us these parts anymore for our DC Metro. Now the DC Metro doesn't work, and we don't have the capacity to scale it up. So I've been on a streak of disagreeing with Kim, so happy to agree with her on this one, that those ships out in the ocean are both, you know, symbolic and actual representations of the failure of globalization. And, you know, it's a wake-up call and needs to be taken seriously by this administration and every administration afterwards, because it's going to be very difficult, excuse the pun, to turn this ship around.
Yeah, and you know, the Trump administration, I think, really honed in on this, and this is one thing that, as I mentioned, Trump was scoffed at for this, saying, "Oh, yeah, you think you're going to bring manufacturing back to America? We're beyond this." But the pandemic, and just even the blockage in the Suez Canal, and you know, there's a variety. Even if we remain open, you know, a lot of the U.S. has remained open during the pandemic, but China just shutting down and saying, "Well, we're closing up," has had this ripple effect. It just takes, in a globalized supply chain, one element of that supply chain going down that we don't have really any control over for it to just completely dismantle the entire system. And I do believe that it's not just about having good working parts. This is a matter of national security. I mean, this is just, I think this pandemic has made that completely clear when in the very beginning we couldn't get basic things like masks. You know, if you can't even manufacture masks when you've got a virus, I mean, we were lucky that this virus wasn't nearly as deadly as a future virus could potentially be, where it's wiping out children and young, healthy adults. I mean, you know, we need to ramp up domestic production. I feel like now more than ever, we're seeing this happen. And we also need to clearly re-regulate, I think, a lot of our supply chain and our infrastructure, building it back up and not letting these companies continue to cut corners. And now look, we're in a complete catastrophe, a collapse. And this isn't just, oh, we'll get over this once the pandemic's over. The pandemic's largely over. And look, we've got 100 ships at sea waiting to come in. Right. What do we do? And
to build on that point, you know, over the next decades, climate scientists are telling us we're going to have extreme weather events much more frequently. Right. So, you know, we're going to have things getting destroyed constantly, which means we're going to have to be constantly rebuilding. And if we can't rebuild internally, we're going to be screwed.
I just don't know how you can be a sovereign nation. You know, to me, it's like, how can you even declare yourself a sovereign nation if you can't, on a dime, close your borders and be self-sufficient? You have to be able to be, to some level. You know,
we should not close our borders and be self-sufficient. The U.S. government, we would have a Suez Canal debacle every day if the U.S. government was in charge of domestic manufacturing. But I guess we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much, Kim, for sharing that perspective. We'll have more Rising right after this.